Guten Tag und hallo, schön, dass Sie wieder da sind. Nun, das Ende naht oder anders gesehen treten wir mit jedem Tag dem Ende immer näher. So oder so bin ich Billy Badger und das ist Bausteine 1. Heute geht es um den Dativ. Herzlich willkommen. Back when we started around 12 weeks ago, we mentioned more or less in passing the idea of cases. The German uses these cases to define the purpose or the role of any nouns, or pronouns for that matter, in a sentence. And look, there are quite a few of them in German, and I remember saying back in week 5 that, well, look, let me defer here to my former self. Nouns or pronouns fall into one of 4 main categories. Now, other languages have fewer cases. English, for example, has only 3, but Latin has somewhere around 6. In this video, we introduced the fancy grammar words for a couple of these cases, the nominative case and the accusative case. And even if we've forgotten the names of these cases, we still remember, I think, that the nominative is used for the subjects of sentences and the accusative for the objects. Of course, in reality, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but let's not get into that right now. But of course, look, they don't just use cases for the sake of it, to make our lives difficult. In part, they're there to help us differentiate between subjects and objects. And how do they do this? Well, we know German uses different articles, these ones here, which of course you'll recognize. And of course, there are also different pronouns, which we also talked about back in week 5. So it kind of stands to reason that if we introduce another case, which is our job for today, then we will again need new articles and new pronouns. So sadly, just when we were thinking we had gotten the hang of when to use ein or einen, we go and add in one more complication. But before we start talking about that, let's consider why, or perhaps better when, we might even need to use this new case, the dative case. Well, look, I think this is a pretty amazing case, and it's going to open up a whole host of new possibilities for us. And the good thing is, you only have to learn a few basics, and then you can start applying them in all sorts of situations. And another good thing is, we have actually used the dative already, without really knowing it. And I'll come back to this idea at the end. Okay, so anyway, let's get started. Also, fangen wir an. We can use the dative for lots of things, but I'm going to narrow it down here to maybe 3 things. Because, well, as we say in German, alle guten Dinge sind 3. All good things come in 3s. And it will be these 3 things. Recipients, otherwise known as the indirect objects, certain verbs that are going to be really useful, and certain prepositions, some of which actually we already know, and in fact we learned in the very first weeks. All right then, first of all then, recipients. Let's take the example of making things. Sie macht einen Kaffee. Well, here we've already got 2 cases at work. We've got somebody doing something, and this is of course our subject, she, who's in the nominative case. We also know that she's making something, this is our direct object, a coffee, which uses that nice accusative article einen, which we're used to seeing for masculine objects. But so far, of course, there's no dative. But let's think about who she's making that coffee for. And this is perhaps here the husband. So the husband, if you like, is the recipient of the coffee, the person for whom it is being made. And recipients are in the dative case. So we'll end up with a sentence like this. Now you'll notice I haven't put in the article because I want to ask you which one should be. Now, it can't be der Mann, because the man himself isn't actually doing anything. He's just sitting around waiting for the coffee. He's not the subject. It can't be den Mann, because we use den for the direct object. And the woman isn't making the man, she's making a coffee. So we're going to need something new. Our sentence needs to be, sie macht dem Mann einen Kaffee. Dem Mann. Now this doesn't just mean the man, but the dem part kind of conveys the idea of to the man, or here probably more for the man. She makes the coffee for the man. And in some ways, look, this idea of the M here on the end is nothing new for us, because this is the very same M that we met already in words like am Montag oder zum Supermarkt, which we'll come back to at the end of the video. Now, if she'd been making the coffee for a woman, no problem, then we again have a different article. Let's take the sentence here. Normally, this would just be simply die Frau. But of course, we need to convey the idea that she's making the coffee for the woman. And die Frau doesn't contain this added information that we need. So we're going to have to change it. Our new sentence is, sie macht der Frau einen Kaffee. She might also, of course, be making me a coffee. Well, I hope so at some stage. Here we need some new pronouns. Clearly we can't use I because, well, I'm not the subject of this sentence. We can't use mich, the me pronoun we learned back in week 5, because we need to make it clear that something is being done for someone. And if we used mich, this would sound like she is making me. Our sentence is then, sie macht mir einen Kaffee. She's still making the coffee, she's just making it for me. What's that? You want one too? I'm sure she'd be happy to oblige. Sie macht dir auch einen Kaffee. Or of course, we're being formal here. Sie macht ihnen einen Kaffee. Of course, while we're at it, we'll have versions of him, her, us, the plural use if she's making the coffee for you and some friends, and them if she's making the coffee for more than one other person. And being super considerate, I've already listed them over here. Oh, hang on. You won't be able to see them. Let's move them over a little bit. A little bit more, that's better. Okay, so look, check these out and really concentrate on learning the versions, the pronouns that you'll be using the most. Now, of course, we're not just limited here to making coffee or making anything for that matter for other people. We could also imagine other situations in which people are recipients, where we maybe, I don't know, send people things, tell them things, or even promise them things, and so on. So, sie schickt ihrem Freund eine SMS. She sends her boyfriend a text. And you'll notice here, even on the possessive adjectives, the his and her words, we use the same endings. And this will always be the case. It doesn't matter whether we are using the definite, the indefinite articles, or possessive adjectives, we just use the same endings. And while we're at it, let's look at a couple of other examples. Maybe, sie bringt ihrem Kind Schokolade. She's bringing her child chocolate. And here, you might notice that child, even though it's neuter, das Kind, it gets the same article endings in the dative as masculine. So we really only have two forms now. The feminine, with the typical ER endings for the dative, or either masculine and neuter, which now share the same EM ending. Well, what about plurals, you say? Well, I hear you. Let's share that chocolate around. Let's say she has more than one child. She has Kinder, children. Well, check this out. Sie kauft ihren Kindern Schokolade. Do you notice what's going on? Yes, we are now using an en ending for the possessive adjective. And look, even if it had been the definite article and she was bringing the kids chocolate, it would still be the same. Sie kauft den Kindern Schokolade. It's that same en ending. But did you notice what else is going on? Even the word Kinder has changed. We are really hitting home the fact that those kids are in the dative, that they are the recipients, that the chocolate is being brought to them. So in the plural, we also add an N onto the end of the noun for the recipient. As long as that recipient is more than one person, and there's, not already an N there, otherwise that would just be silly. And we can use all sorts of other verbs that require a recipient. I won't go into them here. Most of the important ones are in our textbook, so check them out while I move on to the next use of the dative, otherwise we'll be here all day. It's used for recipients, but it's also used for certain verbs. Now, of course, this doesn't really tell you that much. Most verbs, I think we know, at least the ones that we've been using, have a direct object, an object that is somehow or other directly acted on by the verb. But other verbs, and to be fair, there aren't really a lot of them, but many of them are actually fairly useful. These other verbs use only one object, and it's a dative object. At this point, it's worth remembering that the dative often contains the idea of for someone or to someone. I'll show you what I mean. Let's take the verb gefallen. And this is actually the verb that many people use when they say they like something. So if I find something I like, then I can use this verb with the dative to say, das gefällt mir. And here you can see and hear that I'm using the dative, mir. And you'll also, though, notice that at no point am I actually saying I. Now, here the thing, or perhaps the person I like, is the subject, and I am in the dative. This is a bit confusing, but what I'm really saying is not I like this, but this appeals to me. This may, of course, not be something you would often say in English, but it doesn't matter, we're speaking German here, but it's very often the sort of thing that you would say in German if you like something. So, for example, das Buch gefällt mir, aber das Buch gefällt mir nicht. Let's move on to another similar verb. It's actually one we've used before, the verb schmecken, to talk about how things taste. To say maybe, Äpfel schmecken gut. This says, of course, apples taste good. But, taste is a funny thing and not everybody has the same opinions. So German often uses the idea of the dative to communicate the idea that it's your opinion that the apples taste good to you. It's from your perspective. Äpfel schmecken mir. And you could also say, Schokolade schmeckt meiner Frau, which would be the equivalent of saying, my wife likes chocolate. It's just turned around the other way so that the chocolate is the subject and it's the chocolate that tastes good to my wife with that ER ending on mein to communicate this. And a couple of other verbs share the same idea. Let's look at gehören. This means to belong. Now, if you think about this verb in English, you'll realize we often talk about things belonging to someone or maybe something. It's here that German uses again the dative to get across this idea of to someone or to something. So often instead of saying this is mine, which we might do in English, in German we often turn this around and say this belongs to me. And of course, look, the dative is tailor-made for this idea of to me. You'll remember my wife's car from earlier videos. I can say, das Auto gehört meiner Frau. Here the verb communicates the idea of belonging, and that nice ER ending used with the feminine does the heavy lifting of communicating the dative, and with it, the idea that it belongs to my wife. couple of other examples would be perhaps das alte Boot gehört meiner Schwester. The old boat belongs to my sister, or maybe just the old boat is my sister's. And again, that ER ending communicates the idea of it belonging to my sister. Der Wohnwagen gehört meinem Nachbarn. The caravan belongs to my neighbour. And here again, we see that nice EM ending on the possessive adjective mein to communicate the idea of to my neighbour. It belongs to my neighbour. Or das alte Fahrrad gehört mir. The old bicycle belongs to me. This idea, of course, of to me is all nicely contained in and communicated by that dative pronoun mir. And we can use our other pronouns to talk about things that belong to you and other people just as easily. So let's take a couple of things that belong to different people maybe in my family. Das gehört meiner Tochter. Und das gehört meiner Frau. Das kleine Boot gehört meinem Großvater. Die Kinderbücher gehören meinen Neffen. Das gehört mir. So with all our examples, we are using the same dative articles and pronouns that we learned right at the very beginning. So this brings us now to our third and luckily last use of the dative. And this is following certain prepositions. And of course, look, there are a whole lot of these, and no doubt your patience for listening to me drone on about each and every one of them will be fairly limited. So here, I'll recommend you check out the section in the textbook. But look, it will be worth explaining some of them in a little bit more detail. And for the sake of completeness, here is a list of all of the prepositions that we will be using with the dative, like always. So I'll give you a minute just to look down through them. Okay, look, so you'll probably have recognized some of those. And remember, whenever you use one of these prepositions, the very next thing that needs to come out of your mouth has to be either a dative article or a dative pronoun, the same ones that we met earlier. And I think what I want to concentrate on here are prepositions that will just be the most used rather than going through all of them. First, I want to look at a couple of useful prepositions we already know. Let's start with one of the first ones we learned back in, I think it must be week 1, aus. And you'll remember this from your answers to the question, woher kommst du? Ich komme aus Nordirland. I come from Northern Ireland. Now, in most situations, you won't even notice that we're using the dative. But in German, a few countries do actually have an article, so we need to think about it. The most obvious example also actually has an article in English, the United States of America. In German, we can also use the acronym USA, but properly pronounced, of course. So I'll say, ich komme aus den USA. And of course, we're using the den form because USA is plural and we're using the dative. Most countries with an article are either plural, masculine, or feminine. So by now, you should be able to work out the gender of these countries just from the article. Let's see how you go. Kommt aus den Niederlanden. Kommt aus der Schweiz. Sie kommt aus der Türkei. Kommt aus dem Irak. Sie kommt aus dem Iran. Und sie kommen aus dem Libanon. Well, the next preposition I want to look at is also one we have used before. You remember how to answer the question, wo arbeitest du? Where do you work? And you might have answered, for example, ich arbeite bei H&M, or something like that. And you remember I encouraged you at the time to use places that didn't have an article so that we didn't have to use the dative. But now we're learning the dative, we can perhaps say, ich arbeite bei dem Supermarkt. I work at the supermarket. Or maybe, ich arbeite bei dem Krankenhaus. I work at the hospital. Or maybe you work at a chemist, which in German is feminine. So of course, you can hear this from our ending here. Ich arbeite bei einer Apotheke. But we can also use the same preposition for talking about people's places or homes. So maybe you live at your parents' place. Ich wohne bei meinen Eltern. Or maybe at the weekend, you're at your boyfriend or girlfriend's place. So this would be, ich bin am Wochenende bei meinem Freund. Or alternatively, ich bin am Wochenende bei meiner Freundin. And again, we're using those same dative endings we learned earlier. So nothing is new here at all, really. Another useful preposition is mit. This is one that many of us have been using or wanting to use for quite a while anyway. And look, I think we can use this pretty much the same way as it gets used in English, more or less. Ich gehe am Wochenende mit meiner Familie spazieren. I go for a walk with my family at the weekend, ER ending, because we're recognizing that family is feminine. Perhaps the only difference between German and English when we're using the preposition mit or with is when we're talking about different forms of transport. In English, we might travel on the train or, I don't know, on the bus. But in German, this would put you up on the roof. So instead, we say, ich fahre mit dem Bus zur Uni. Well, I want to finish up here by revisiting one preposition we have used before, and hopefully by now we'll be able to see why we use the forms we do. This is the preposition zu, and we use the forms zum to talk about going to masculine and neuter places, and the form zur to talk about going to feminine places. Now, what we were doing here was combining the preposition zu with the dative articles dem and der. So we came up with sentences like these. Ich gehe oft zum Supermarkt. Or ich gehe manchmal zum Strand. Ich gehe nicht sehr oft zur Bank. Ich gehe auch nicht sehr oft zur Post. Now, I haven't gone through all the different prepositions here, but I really just want to draw your attention to the fact that there are some prepositions where you've just got to stop and make sure that you're using the dative. So I'd really recommend you check out these in your textbook because I've gone into a lot more detail there. But before I finish up, and I'm sure I've said this before, I just want to remind you of 3 places where we actually have already used the dative to show you actually that this is nothing new and you've been using it all along. Firstly, you'll remember how to ask somebody how they're doing. Wie geht's dir? Or more formally perhaps, wie geht es Ihnen? And here you can see we are using the dative pronoun because look, I'm asking how things are going for you. And we'll remember that this is an important use of the dative. And then of course there were our time phrases. We used, for example, this preposition, for days. Ich laufe oft am Wochenende. And here, means on the or at the, because it's short for an dem, which we'll recognize immediately as the dative article. We've also used im for months and seasons. In Tasmanien regnet es oft im Winter. And here you can probably guess already that im is short for in dem. And finally, we briefly listed some place phrases that use the dative. And here it's really important to remember that location is always governed by the dative. Anytime you're saying where you are or where something happens or where something is, you need to use the dative. Here are a couple of examples of that from our textbook so you can see what I mean. Am Wochenende bin ich gern am Strand. Here, am again means at the. So I'm saying at the beach. We're clearly talking about location when we hear that word am. Or maybe you want to say where you live. Ich wohne in einem Studentenwohnheim. I live in a student apartment block. So do look back through this section in your textbook to identify some other examples of location phrases that you might find useful. Und so, das war's dann für heute und auch diese Woche. Ich wünsche Ihnen eine schöne Woche und wie immer, wenn Sie Fragen haben, schreiben Sie sie unten in den Kommentaren. Alles Gute, auf Wiedersehen und Tschüss.